The wind did not just blow across the eastern plains of Wyoming. It scoured them. It was a relentless, invisible hand that stripped the topsoil from the fields and drove grit into the deepest creases of a man's skin. Under a low, slate-gray sky that promised rain but only delivered dust, the land stretched out in shades of brown and bruised purple. It was the late 1870s, and the territory was in the grip of a drought that had turned the high grass into tinder and the creek beds into graveyards of cracked mud. Daniel Crow stood by the northern fence line, the wire cutters heavy in his leather-gloved hand. He was a man built of hard angles and silence, 38 years old but looking 50 in the failing light. He squinted against the stinging grit, looking out over his herd. The cattle were thin, their ribs pushing against their dusty hides like the staves of a barrel. They stood with their heads low, too tired to graze on the scrub brush that remained. Daniel wiped a hand across his forehead, leaving a streak of mud where the sweat mixed with the dirt. He had been out here since before the sun had cleared the horizon, dragging weak calves out of dry washes and mending posts that the wind had worried until they snapped. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim lower. The weight of the ranch sat on his shoulders, heavier than the fence post he'd just driven into the unforgiving earth. Every calculation he made in his head ended in the same red number. The feed was low, the water was muddy and shrinking, and the debt he owed to the bank in town was growing like a cancer. But Daniel was not a man to complain. He believed in the gospel of labor. If he worked hard enough, if he bled enough, he could hold this world together. He rode back toward the homestead as the sun dipped below the jagged line of the mountains, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and blood red. The house was a sturdy structure of rough-hewn timber, huddled in a shallow depression as if trying to hide from the wind. A light flickered in the window. Rose was awake. Rose. Even the thought of her name softened the hard line of his jaw. Inside, the house was a sanctuary against the grit. Rose kept it that way. She was sweeping the floor when he entered, her movements graceful and precise. She was a beautiful woman, with dark hair that she pinned up severely. Those stray curls always managed to escape to frame a face that was too sharp and knowing for a simple ranch wife. She had eyes the color of polished walnut, watchful and careful. She stopped sweeping as he came in, the door latch clicking shut behind him. The silence between them was not empty, but it was heavy. "You are late," she said softly. Her voice had a huskiness to it, a remnant of a life she tried hard to forget. "Checking the north pasture," Daniel replied. He hung his hat on the peg and moved to the basin to wash. The water was cold. I had to pull a heifer out of the brush. She was down. Rose set the broom aside and walked to the stove. She moved with a caution that always made Daniel's chest ache. It was as if she were waiting for a blow or a harsh word, things he had never given her but which she seemed to expect from the world. She brought him a plate of beans and salt pork. As he sat at the rough wooden table, she noticed his hands. He had torn the skin across his knuckles on a rusted barb, and the blood had dried dark and crusted. "Let me see that," she said. "It is nothing," Daniel said, reaching for his fork. Rose did not listen. She fetched a strip of clean linen and a jar of salve. She took his hand in hers, her fingers cool and smooth against his calloused palm. Daniel stopped eating. He watched her head bent over his hand, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. This was their intimacy. She was bandaging his hurts, him fixing the roof over her head. He remembered the first time he saw her, 4 years ago. It had been in a saloon in a mining town 2 days' ride south. She had been cornered by a patron, a man drunk on whiskey and cruelty, who had paid for her time and thought it bought him the right to break her. Daniel had not planned to interfere. He was a man who minded his own business. But when he saw the terror in her eyes, something ancient and protective woke up in him. He had stepped in, knocked the man down, and in the strange, adrenaline-fueled aftermath, he had offered her a way out, marriage, a ranch, a life where no one could buy her time again. She had said yes because she had no other choice. It was a bargain of survival. He knew that, but over the years, he had hoped it would become more. "Does it hurt?" she asked, tying the knot on the bandage. No, he lied. It feels fine. She looked up at him, searching his face. He wanted to tell her how beautiful she looked in the lamplight. He wanted to tell her that he was terrified they were going to lose the ranch, and that he felt like a failure every time he looked at the starving cattle. But the words stuck in his throat, blocked by a lifetime of learning that a man did not burden a woman with his fears. "Thank you," he said instead. She lingered for a second, her hand resting on his wrist. "I made coffee." She said, "That is good," he replied. She pulled her hand away and turned back to the stove. The moment passed, unseized. Rose busied herself with the pot, her shoulders tight. She wanted him to talk to her. She wanted him to ask her about her day, about the book she was reading, about anything other than the cattle and the weather. But Daniel ate in silence, thinking that his silence was a kindness, a shield protecting her from the harsh truths of their life. The following Sunday, they drove the wagon into town for the church service and the picnic that followed. It was a social obligation Daniel loathed, but one he endured for the sake of appearance. The town was small, a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to the dust. The church was whitewashed and stark. Rose wore a blue dress, simple but fitted, which showed off her figure. She held her head high, but Daniel saw the way her knuckles turned white where she gripped her parasol. As they walked from the wagon to the churchyard, the conversation among the gathered townsfolk seemed to dip in volume, then resume in hushed whispers. Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, stood with two other women near the entrance. They did not greet Rose. Instead, their eyes raked over her, judging the cut of her dress, the set of her hair, and the history written in her walk. Daniel heard a fragment of their words as he tied the horses. "Brought the sin right with her," one woman murmured. "You can take the girl out of the saloon," another whispered, followed by a sharp, cruel titter. Daniel froze. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could turn around. He could confront them. He could demand they show his wife respect. But he knew that a scene would only make it worse. It would only give them more to talk about, more fuel for their self-righteous fires. So he swallowed his anger, his jaw working silently. He finished tying the reins and walked to Rose, offering his arm. "Ready?" he asked, his voice flat. Rose looked at him. She had heard them too. She saw the tension in his neck, the way his eyes avoided the women. She waited for him to say something, to acknowledge the insult, to defend her honor with a word or a glare. But he just stood there, stoic and enduring. She took his arm, her touch light and cold. "Yes," she said, "I am ready." She felt exposed, standing there in the bright sun. His silence felt like agreement, or worse, shame. She felt that he was ashamed of her, that he regretted the bargain he had made. They walked into the church, sitting in a pew near the back, together but miles apart. 2 days later, the financial pressure materialized in the form of Mr. Henderson, the bank agent. He rode out in a black buggy that looked like a beetle scurrying across the dry plains. Daniel met him on the porch. Rose stayed inside, watching from behind the lace curtain. Mr. Henderson did not get down from the buggy. He was a man who preferred not to get dust on his boots. "The drought is not breaking." "Crow," the agent said, adjusting his spectacles. "It will rain," Daniel said, leaning against the porch rail. "It always does. Not soon enough for the bank," Henderson replied. "I am here to tell you that the directors are getting nervous. You are behind on the interest. If you do not make a payment by the end of the month, we will have to discuss foreclosure." Daniel felt a cold pit open in his stomach. He looked at his land, at the barn he had built with his own hands. "I will have the money," he said. "See that you do," Henderson said. He flicked the reins, and the buggy turned around, leaving a cloud of dust that drifted over Daniel. Daniel stood there for a long time. He felt humiliated. He was a man who paid his debts. He was a man who provided. He turned and went into the house. Rose was standing by the table. "What did he want?" she asked. "Business," Daniel said shortly. He walked past her to the desk where he kept his ledger. "Is it bad?" Rose asked. "Daniel, tell me." "It is fine," he snapped, louder than he intended. He saw her flinch, and he hated himself. but he could not look at her. If he looked at her, he would have to admit that he was failing her. He sat down at the desk and opened the book, staring at the columns of numbers until they blurred. Rose stood there for a moment, then turned and walked into the bedroom, closing the door softly. Daniel remained in the dim lamplight, calculating debts he could not pay, carrying the weight of the world in silence. The work was too much for one man, especially with the cattle weakening. Daniel knew he needed help, but he could barely afford to feed himself and Rose. Yet, if he lost the herd, he lost everything. It was a cruel paradox. It was a Tuesday when Eli Ward rode into the yard. He came on a chestnut mare that had seen better days, but the man himself sat in the saddle with an easy, fluid grace. He was younger than Daniel, perhaps 25 or 26. He wore a battered hat pushed back to reveal a face that was handsome in a boyish, open way. He had a scar above his left eyebrow, and his clothes were worn but mended with care. Daniel walked out to meet him, a hammer in his hand. "Afternoon," the stranger called out. His voice was bright, carrying a lilt that spoke of places further east. "Afternoon," Daniel grunted. "Name is Eli Ward," the young man said. "I am looking for work. I have done ranching, horse breaking, and I can fix a wagon wheel if need be. I do not eat much, and I do not complain." Daniel looked him over. The boy looked soft compared to the men who usually drifted through, but there was a steadiness in his eyes. And Daniel was desperate. "I cannot pay much," Daniel said. "Room and board, and $10 a month." Eli smiled, and it was a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "That sounds like a fortune to a man with empty pockets." "You are hired," Daniel said. "Put your horse in the barn." He watched as Eli dismounted. The young man favored his left leg slightly. A subtle limp, a soldier's injury, perhaps. Daniel felt a pang of gratitude for the help. But as Eli walked toward the barn, Rose came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Who is that?" she asked. "New hand," Daniel said. "Name is Eli." Eli stopped and tipped his hat to Rose. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said. His voice was polite, respectful, but he looked at her. He really looked at her, meeting her eyes directly. "Good afternoon," Rose said. She smoothed her hair self-consciously. Daniel saw the exchange. It was nothing, just a greeting, but he saw the way Rose's posture shifted, becoming less rigid. He saw a flicker of interest in her eyes. He pushed the feeling down. He was tired. He was imagining things. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic on the ranch shifted. Eli was a good worker. He was quick with the horses and had a gentle touch with the skittish cattle. But it was in the evenings, or during the brief pauses in the day, that his presence was most felt. He was a talker. He had stories about the war, about cities like St. Louis and Chicago, about theaters and music halls. He knew jokes that made Rose laugh, a sound Daniel had not heard in months. One afternoon, Daniel came back from the south pasture to find Rose and Eli by the corral. Rose had brought out a pot of coffee. She was leaning against the fence, holding a tin cup, and Eli was standing on the other side. Resting his arms on the top rail, "I saw a woman in a dress made entirely of red silk," Eli was saying, his hands moving to describe the shape. It rustled when she walked, like dry leaves, but it shone like fire. Rose's eyes were wide. "I have never seen silk like that," she said. "I always wanted a dress that wasn't gray or brown. It would look fine in red," Eli said. He said it simply, without lewdness, just a statement of fact. Rose blushed, looking down at her coffee. Daniel stopped his horse a few yards away. He felt a sudden, sharp twist in his chest. It was not anger, exactly. It was a hollow ache. He realized he had never told Rose she would look good in red. He had never noticed that she dreamed of such things. He had only worried about whether her boots had holes or if the winter coat was warm enough. He rode up, the hoofbeats of his horse breaking the spell. Rose straightened up quickly, almost guiltily. "Coffee, Daniel?" she asked. "No," Daniel said. "The water trough in the lower paddock is leaking. Eli, I need you to ride out and fix it. Right away, boss." Eli said. He drained his cup and handed it back to Rose. "Thank you for the coffee, ma'am. It was better than anything I have had in a year." He winked at her, a small, playful gesture, and went to saddle his horse. Daniel watched him go, then looked at Rose. She was still holding the empty cup, a faint smile playing on her lips. She caught him watching her, and the smile vanished. "I will start supper," she said, turning back to the house. Daniel stayed by the corral, watching the dust settle. He felt old. He felt dull and gray, like the landscape. While Eli was a splash of color, he told himself it was good that Rose had someone to talk to. She was lonely. It was innocent, but the seed of jealousy, once planted, found fertile ground in his insecurity. The drought held on, tightening its grip. The tension in the house grew alongside the heat. Daniel worked harder, punishing himself, coming in late and leaving early. He spoke less and less, his mind consumed by the fear of the bank. Eli, meanwhile, seemed to fill the silence Daniel left behind. He helped Rose with the heavy water buckets. He fixed the loose shutter that had been banging for weeks, something Daniel had meant to do but never found the time for. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bed, dusty purple sage blossoms that were struggling to survive. One evening, the sky turned a bruised yellow-green. The wind died down suddenly, creating a vacuum of silence that was more terrifying than the noise. Daniel looked up from the anvil in the barn. "Dust storm," he said. "He ran out." A wall of darkness was moving across the plains, swallowing the world. It was a mile high and churning like a tidal wave of earth. "Eli! Rose!" Daniel shouted. They came running from the house. "The herd!" Daniel yelled. "We have to get them into the lee of the ravine. If they scatter in this, we will never find them." They mounted up, Rose taking the old mare she sometimes rode. The three of them rode hard toward the cattle, the darkness racing them. The wind hit them before they reached the herd, a solid blow that nearly knocked Daniel from his saddle. It was not air. It was gravel and sand blasting at 60 miles an hour. The cattle were bawling, milling in a panic. The world became a brown chaos. Daniel could barely see his own horse's head. He tied a bandana over his face and rode into the mass, shouting, whistling, driving them toward the shelter of the rocks. He saw Eli and Rose through the haze. They were cutting off a group of stragglers. The wind screamed, tearing at their clothes. Rose's horse stumbled, spooked by a tumbling tumbleweed. She fought the reins, but the animal reared. "Rose!" Daniel screamed, but the wind swallowed his voice. He spurred his horse forward, but Eli was closer. Eli abandoned the cattle and drove his horse alongside Rose. He reached out, grabbing the bridle of her mare with one hand and wrapping his other arm around Rose's waist to steady her. For a moment, they were locked together in the heart of the storm. The wind whipped Rose's hair around their faces. Eli pulled her close, shouting something into her ear. Rose clung to his arm, her face buried in his coat. She looked terrified, but she also looked held. Daniel reined in his horse, watching through the flying grit. He saw the way Eli held her. It was the grip of a man saving a life. Yes, but it was also the grip of a man who did not want to let go. And he saw Rose, for just a second, lean into him, seeking shelter not just from the wind, but from the world. The moment broke. The horses steadied. They turned the cattle and drove them into the ravine as the storm swallowed them whole. They rode back to the house in a tight knot, the wind howling around them. When they got inside, they were covered in a layer of fine gray dust. It was in their hair, their eyelashes, the lines of their faces. They stood in the kitchen, coughing and shaking out their coats. "Is everyone all right?" Daniel asked, his voice rough. "I am fine," Eli said, wiping his face. That was a close one. Rose was trembling. She sank into a chair. "I thought the horse was going down," she whispered. Eli stepped toward her, his hand reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, then dropping to his side. "You rode well. Rose, you stayed in the saddle." Daniel saw the aborted gesture. He saw the look that passed between them, a shared intensity born of adrenaline and something else. He felt like a stranger in his own kitchen. "I'm going to check the barn," Daniel said abruptly. He turned and went back out into the howling dark, leaving them alone. That night, the wind rattled the walls of the house, a constant, abrasive drone. Daniel came to bed late. He did not light the lamp. He undressed in the dark, his body aching from the day's labor. He could hear Rose breathing. She was awake. He climbed into the bed, the mattress groaning under his weight. He lay on his back, staring up at the invisible ceiling. He was inches away from her. He could feel the warmth radiating from her body. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to pull her against him, to feel her skin, to be reassured that she was his wife and he was her husband. But the image of Eli's arm around her waist burned in his mind. The memory of her laughter by the corral, the silence that had grown between them like a wall. He turned on his side, his back to her. "Good night, Rose," he said into the darkness. There was a long pause. He heard the sheets rustle as she shifted. She looked at his broad back, a wall of muscle and scars. She wanted to touch him. She wanted to tell him that she was scared, not just of the storm, but of the feelings that were waking up inside her, feelings that Eli stirred just by looking at her. She wanted Daniel to turn around and hold her, to fight for her, to be the man who rescued her again. But the distance between them felt too great to bridge. "Good night, Daniel," she whispered. Outside, the wind howled, burying the ranch in dust, while inside, the silence buried them in loneliness. The weeks that followed dragged by like a crippled wagon wheel turning in deep mud. The drought did not just persist. It dug its claws into the land and refused to let go. The sky remained a relentless, expansive sheet of pale blue during the day, fading to a suffocating gray at twilight. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the Crow Ranch until the earth cracked in jagged fissures that looked like wounds. Daniel Crow became a ghost in his own life. The ranch demanded everything he had, and he gave it without reservation. He rose before the sun had even thought of painting the horizon and returned long after the coyotes had begun their nightly chorus. His temper, usually as steady as a rock, began to fray at the edges. He did not shout. Daniel was not a shouter. But his silence grew sharper, colder. When a stirrup leather broke, he did not curse. He simply threw the saddle down with a violence that made the dust jump, his jaw working silently as he stared at the horizon. He retreated into labor as if it were a fortress, shutting out the dying cattle, the dry well, and the wife who watched him with wide, worried eyes. Rose felt the house shrinking around her. The air inside was stifling, thick with the unsaid things that hung between her and her husband. She began to seek small escapes, reasons to be out of the dim rooms where the silence felt heaviest. She would take the feed bucket to the chickens and linger there, scattering the grain kernel by kernel, watching the birds peck at the dry ground. She walked to the far fence line, telling herself she was checking for breaks. But in truth, she just wanted to feel the wind on her face, hot and dry as it was. And she stayed outside because Eli was outside. She hated herself for it. She hated the way her heart stuttered in her chest when she saw him crossing the yard, his hat tipped back, whistling a tune that sounded like it belonged in a dance hall. She hated the way she checked her reflection in the darkened window glass before stepping out onto the porch. But she could not stop. The ranch was a prison of work and worry, and Eli Ward was the only window that let in any light. Eli had settled into the rhythm of the place, but he moved through it differently than Daniel. Where Daniel attacked the work with grim determination, Eli moved with a fluid, easy grace. He seemed to find small moments of pleasure even in the harshness. He began to find reasons to be near the house. One afternoon, Rose struggled with the heavy water buckets from the pump. The handles squeaked in protest, the sound grating in the stillness. Before she could lift the full pails, Eli was there. "Let me get that." "Rose," he said. He did not wait for an answer. He took the buckets from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. His skin was warm, rough with work, but gentle in its touch. "You do not have to do that," Rose said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You have your own work. I always have time to help a lady," Eli said with a smile that showed his white teeth. "Besides, Daniel has me mending the corral fence. This is on the way." It was not on the way, and they both knew it. He carried the water to the kitchen door, setting the buckets down without spilling a drop. He lingered on the step, taking off his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. "Hot one today," he said. He. "Yes," Rose agreed. "The heat never seems to end." Eli looked past her, into the shadowed kitchen. "It is cooler in the evenings. Though, back in St. Louis, we used to go down to the river when it got this hot. There was music playing from the steamboats. You could hear the fiddles drifting over the water." Rose leaned against the doorframe, a pang of longing striking her chest. "I have never seen a steamboat," she said softly. "You would like it," Eli said, his voice dropping an octave. "The lights on the water, the people dancing. It is a world away from this dust." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. "I found these down in the dry wash," he said. They were hiding in the shade of a rock. He held out a small bunch of wildflowers, purple and defiant against the brown of his palm. Rose stared at them. Daniel had not brought her flowers since the day they were married, and even then, he had looked awkward holding them. "They are beautiful," she whispered. "Like I said," Eli murmured, his eyes holding hers, hiding in the shade. He placed them on the railing and put his hat back on. "I best get back to that fence before the boss wonders if I have melted away." Rose watched him walk away, her hand going to the flowers. She touched the delicate petals, feeling a flush rise on her neck that had nothing to do with the sun. The town offered no respite. A week later, Rose had to go to the general store for supplies, flour, coffee, and thread. Daniel was too busy moving the herd to the south pasture to go, so she harnessed the buggy herself. The town of Blackwood sat baking in the sun, a collection of weathered buildings that looked as tired as the people living in them. Rose tied the horse to the rail outside the mercantile and smoothed her dress. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She kept her head high, walking with the careful dignity she had constructed like armor. Inside, the store smelled of sawdust, spices, and old tobacco. Mr. Gable was behind the counter, weighing sugar for Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Higgins, two women who held their Bibles like weapons. The conversation stopped the moment Rose entered. The silence was sudden and sharp. "Good morning, Mr. Gable," Rose said, her voice steady. Gable nodded, not meeting her eyes. "Mrs. Crow, I will be with you in a moment." Rose moved to the shelves, feigning interest in a bolt of calico. She could feel the eyes of the women boring into her back. "I heard the drought is hitting the Crow place hard, Mrs. Miller said, her voice pitched loud enough to carry but low enough to claim discretion. "It hits everyone," Mrs. Higgins replied. "But the Lord tests the righteous and punishes the wicked." Rose's hand froze on the fabric. "They say he is drowning in debt," Mrs. Miller continued. "It is a shame. Daniel Crow is a good man, hard-working. He must be desperate," Mrs. Higgins said, her tone dripping with venom, "to take on a burden like he did." "A burden?" Mrs. Miller asked, feigning ignorance. "Marrying a woman like that?" Mrs. Higgins hissed. "You know what they say. Once a whore, always a whore. You can put a ring on it, but you cannot wash the stain out." The words hit Rose like a physical blow. The air left her lungs. Humiliation burned in her chest, hot and suffocating. She gripped the edge of the shelf, her knuckles white. She wanted to turn around and scream at them. She wanted to tell them that she had done what she had to do to survive, that she was more than the sum of her past sins, but she knew it would do no good. To them, she was not a person. She was a cautionary tale. She turned, leaving the calico, leaving the list of supplies in her pocket. She walked out of the store, her chin trembling, her vision blurred by unshed tears. She heard the tinkle of the bell above the door and the soft, cruel laughter that followed her out. She climbed into the buggy, her hands shaking so badly she could barely untie the reins. She whipped the horse, driving out of town faster than was safe, desperate to put the dust of Blackwood behind her. That night, the silence at the dinner table was absolute. Daniel sat hunched over his plate, his face gray with exhaustion. He had spent the day pulling a calf out of a mud pit, and the stench of swamp mud clung to him. Rose picked at her food. The words from the store still rang in her ears, a poisoned chorus. She looked at Daniel, wanting him to ask her how her day was, wanting him to see the pain in her eyes. "How are the cattle?" she asked, her voice thin. Daniel did not look up. "We lost 2 more, he said. "The mud is drying up. If we do not get rain soon—" He let the sentence hang. He did not ask about her trip to town. He did not notice that she had returned without the flour. He pushed his plate away and stood up. "I have to go over the accounts," he said. Rose watched him go. The door to the study closed with a click. She sat alone at the table, the tears finally spilling over. She felt hollowed out, abandoned by the one man who had promised to protect her. She went out to the porch, needing air. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the dark shapes of the hills. "They are wrong. You know." The voice came from the shadows by the bunkhouse. Eli stepped into the pool of light cast by the kitchen window. He was smoking a cigarette, the ember glowing like a red eye. Rose hastily wiped her cheeks. "I did not know you were there. I was in town today, too," Eli said quietly, picking up nails for the barn roof. "I heard them." Rose stiffened. "You heard?" "I heard 2 old hens clucking about things they do not understand." Eli said. He walked closer, stopping at the foot of the steps. He looked up at her, his expression serious. "They do not know you." "Rose," he said. "They know what I was," Rose said bitterly. "They know a story," Eli corrected. "They do not know the woman standing right here. They do not know how you keep this house, how you tend the garden even when the sun tries to burn it down. They do not see you." "I am just a burden to Daniel," she whispered, the fear she had carried all day finally finding a voice. "That is what they said." Eli threw his cigarette down and crushed it under his boot. "Daniel is a fool if he believes that," he said, his voice hard. "And those women are blind." He stepped up onto the first step of the porch. "You are not hard. Rose, you are not stained. In my eyes, you are as soft and fine as any lady back east. You deserve to be looked at with respect. You deserve to be cherished." Rose looked at him, her heart pounding. His words were a balm to the raw wounds the town had inflicted. He saw her. He really saw her. "Thank you, Eli," she said, her voice trembling. He looked at her for a long moment, the tension stretching between them. Then he nodded, tipped his hat, and walked back toward the bunkhouse, leaving her standing there with her heart racing in the dark. The weather turned a few days later, but not for the better. The heat grew heavy, oppressive. Clouds gathered on the horizon, towering anvils of dark gray, but they refused to break. Thunder grumbled low in the throat of the sky, vibrating in the ground, but no rain fell. The air was charged with static, the horses were skittish, and the hair on Rose's arms stood on end. It was a restless evening. Daniel was still out, checking the perimeter fence. Rose went to the barn to gather eggs. Though she knew the hens had likely stopped laying in this heat, it was an excuse to move, to do something with her hands. The barn was dim and smelled of dry hay and horses. The air inside was thick, trapped. Rose moved to the nesting boxes, checking them one by one. Empty, empty. She heard the barn door creak. She turned, expecting Daniel. It was Eli. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the purple twilight. He walked in, the dust swirling around his boots. "Storm is building," he said. "You can feel it in your teeth." "Yes," Rose said. She leaned against the wooden stall, clutching the empty basket. "It feels like the world is holding its breath." Eli walked closer. He stopped a few feet away from her. The lantern hanging on the post cast long, dancing shadows. He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. "You have a piece of straw in your hair," he said softly. Rose reached up to brush it away, but Eli was faster. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly. He brushed the straw from her temple, his fingers lingering on her skin. His touch was electric, sending a shock through her that had nothing to do with the storm. He did not pull his hand away. He cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His skin was rough, but his touch was incredibly tender. "Rose," he whispered. Rose could not move. She felt pinned by his gaze, by the overwhelming need that radiated from him. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it?" Eli asked. He stepped closer, invading her space, filling her world. "Everything about this place feels wrong. Rose, the dust, the heat, the way Daniel looks right through you. Everything feels dead except you." He leaned in, his eyes searching hers. "You are the only thing that feels alive." He kissed her. It was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. Rose stood frozen, her mind screaming at her to push him away, to run back to the house, back to her vows, but her body betrayed her. Her body, starved for touch, starved for affection, leaned into him. The kiss deepened, becoming desperate. Eli groaned low in his throat, his arms going around her, pulling her flush against him. Rose dropped the basket. Her hands went to his shoulders, gripping his shirt. They clung to each other, shaking, two drowning people finding a piece of driftwood in a dark ocean. For a moment, there was nothing but the taste of him, the smell of rain and tobacco, and the heat of his body. Then the reality of what she was doing crashed down on her. Rose gasped and pulled away. Stumbling back, she put a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "No," she said, tears springing to her eyes. "No, I am married." Eli stood there, his chest heaving, his face flushed. "Rose, I cannot," she said, "I cannot do this." She turned and ran out of the barn, leaving him standing in the shadows, the taste of her still on his lips. For the next 3 days, Rose moved through the house like a woman walking on a ledge. She threw herself into her chores with a manic energy. She scrubbed the floors until her knees were bruised. She mended every shirt Daniel owned. She baked bread, kneading the dough with fierce, punishing strokes. She avoided Eli. If she saw him coming toward the house, she went to the bedroom. If he was at the corral, she stayed in the garden. She tried to speak more gently to Daniel, trying to bridge the gap between them, trying to prove to herself that she was still a good wife. "Daniel," she said one evening as he sat cleaning his rifle, "I made stew tonight, with the last of the potatoes." Daniel nodded, not looking up from the gun barrel. "Good. I was thinking," she ventured, her voice wavering. "Maybe when the rain comes, we could go for a ride, just the two of us, up to the ridge?" Daniel paused, wiping oil from the metal. "There is no time for riding. Rose, the fence in the west section is down. The herd is scattering. I do not have time for picnics." His voice was flat, exhausted. He did not mean to be cruel, but his rejection cut her to the bone. He did not see her effort. He did not see that she was fighting for them, fighting against the tide of her own heart. Rose stood there, the rejection settling in her stomach like a stone. She looked at his bent head, at the tension in his shoulders. He was a good man, she told herself, but he was a wall, and she was tired of throwing herself against him and only getting bruises in return. The more she tried to reach Daniel, the more his silence pushed her away. And every time she was pushed, she felt the pull of the barn, the pull of the man who had looked at her and called her beautiful. The break came with the dry lightning. It was evening again. The sky a bruised purple canvas where silent flashes of light danced from cloud to cloud. The air was hot enough to blister. Rose sat on the porch steps, watching the light show. She felt trapped in her own skin. She heard a boot scrape on the dirt. She did not turn. She knew who it was. "Go away." "Eli," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I cannot," he said. He sat down on the step below her, close enough that she could feel his heat, but not touching her. "I have been thinking about what you said," Rose said, staring at the lightning. "About feeling trapped." "I did not say that," Eli said softly. "You did. With your eyes." Rose let out a shaky breath. Confessions began to spill out of her. Words she had never spoken to anyone. Not even Daniel. "When I was in the saloon," she said, her voice hollow, I felt like an animal in a cage. Men looked at me, and they saw something they could buy. When Daniel took me away, I thought I was free. I thought he saved me." She turned to look at Eli, tears streaming down her face, but he never asked me what I wanted. He never asked me who I was. He just put me in a different cage, a safer one. Yes, but I am just another obligation to him, another mouth to feed, another thing to protect. She buried her face in her hands. I do not want to be an obligation. Eli, I want to be chosen. Eli moved then. He turned and wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her down so her head rested on his shoulder. He did not try to kiss her. He just held her. He pressed his face into her hair, rocking her slightly. I choose you, Rose. He whispered into the darkness. I choose you. Rose felt his own loneliness in the way he held her. He was a drifter, a man without a home, and in her, he had found an anchor, and in him, she had found a mirror. One night a week later, Daniel announced he had to ride to the far pasture. The coyotes are getting bold, he said, strapping on his gun belt. They took a calf last night. I'm going to wait for them. I might be gone all night. Rose stood by the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Be careful, Daniel. He nodded, put on his hat, and walked out into the night. Rose waited. She waited until the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the wind. Then she waited another hour, pacing the kitchen floor, her hands twisting in her apron. The house felt empty. The silence was deafening. She blew out the lamp. She walked out into the yard. The moon was hidden behind the clouds. The barn loomed ahead, a dark shape against the sky. She knew Eli was there. He slept in the loft. She pushed open the heavy door. The smell of hay and horses hit her, familiar and intoxicating. She climbed the ladder to the loft, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Eli? She whispered. He was sitting up on his bedroll, the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the roof, illuminating his face. He looked at her, and he did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment his whole life. Rose, he said. She went to him. There was no hesitation this time. She sank to her knees in the hay, and he reached for her. Their mouths met with a hunger that was terrifying in its intensity. It was not gentle, it was urgent. It was the breaking of a dam. He pulled her down onto the blanket. His hands were shaking as they fumbled with the buttons of her dress. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. They clung to each other as if the world outside did not exist, as if the drought and the debt and the husband riding in the dark were nothing but bad dreams. The act was heated and trembling. It was a release of months of pent-up longing and loneliness. Rose felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She felt alive. For the first time in years, she felt her blood singing in her veins. She was not a wife, not a saloon girl, not a burden. She was just Rose, and she was wanted. But afterward, the silence returned. Rose lay in the hay, staring up at the shadows of the rafters. The reality of what she had done settled over her like a cold shroud. She buttoned her dress with trembling fingers. Eli tried to touch her arm, but she flinched away. I have to go, she whispered. Rose, do not, she said, please, do not say anything. She climbed down the ladder and ran back to the house. She washed herself with cold water from the basin, scrubbing her skin until it was red, trying to wash away the scent of him, the scent of her betrayal. When Daniel returned just before dawn, she was in bed, pretending to sleep. He smelled of the night, of cold air, sweat, leather, and horse. He undressed quietly and climbed in beside her. Rose lay rigid, her eyes wide open in the dark. She felt the heat of his body. His hand, rough and calloused, flopped onto the mattress, resting inches from hers. It was an unconscious gesture, familiar and safe. A wave of nausea washed over her. She realized, with a sickening clarity, that she still needed him. Eli was a fire, bright and consuming, but Daniel was the earth, and she had just salted the earth. The guilt was a physical pain, sharp and cutting. She turned her face into the pillow to stifle a sob. Daniel sensed the change. He was not a man of words. But he was a man of instincts. He knew when a storm was coming by the smell of the air, and he knew something had shifted in his house. Rose's eyes avoided his. She would not look at him directly. She jumped when he spoke. And Eli. Eli's gaze flickered with something that looked like apology, or perhaps pity. They moved around each other carefully, like dancers who knew the steps but were afraid to touch. If Rose went to the pump, Eli found a reason to be in the barn. If Eli came to the porch, Rose went inside. It felt choreographed. It felt controlled. Daniel watched them. He watched the way they didn't look at each other. He watched the tension that hummed in the air whenever they were in the same room. His stomach knotted. His mind, usually occupied with cattle counts and debt, began to turn to darker possibilities. He told himself he was crazy. He told himself Rose was loyal. He told himself Eli was a friend. But the doubt was a worm, eating at the core of him. 3 days later, Daniel rode out to the north pasture to check a water hole. But halfway there, he turned back. He told himself he had forgotten his wire cutters. But in his heart, he knew he was checking something else. He rode into the yard quietly. The wind was blowing from the west, carrying sound toward him. He saw them in the corral. Rose was standing by the gate. Eli was inside, leaning over the rail. They were not touching, but they were standing too close. Their bodies were angled toward each other, magnetized. It was the posture of intimacy. Daniel stopped his horse, hidden by the corner of the barn. He strained to hear. "Cannot keep doing this," Rose was saying, her voice strained. "We have to talk about it," Eli said. His voice was low, intimate, the tone of a lover. "Rose, what we did." Daniel did not hear the rest. He did not need to. The words, "what we did," hung in the air, clearer than a bell. The final confirmation stabbed through him, colder than any winter wind. It was not a suspicion anymore. It was a fact. His wife, his hand. Daniel sat on his horse, his hands gripping the reins until the leather creaked. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The ranch, the cattle, the debt, it all faded into the background. All that remained was the image of the two of them standing in the sun, and the hollow, gaping hole in his chest where his heart used to be. He turned his horse around and rode back out onto the plains, needing to be anywhere but there. The wind howled around the corners of the ranch house like a living thing seeking entry, scraping handfuls of grit against the glass panes. Inside, the only light came from a kerosene lantern turned low on the kitchen table, its flames sputtering in the drafts that bled through the walls. Daniel Crow sat in a wooden chair that felt too small for his frame, his hands clasped so tightly before him that the knuckles shone white like bone. He had not slept. The bed in the other room was empty, save for his wife, who lay turned toward the wall, feigning sleep or perhaps lost in a dream of a man who was not her husband. Daniel stared at the grain of the wood table, tracing the scars in the timber with his eyes. Every scratch seemed to mock him. He felt a rage that was cold and heavy in his gut, sitting alongside a shame that burned like acid. He was failing. He was failing the land, which was turning to dust under his boots. He was failing the cattle, which were dropping one by one, their carcasses left for the buzzards. And he was failing Rose. The image of them in the corral, the angle of their bodies, the intimacy of their voices, played on a loop in his mind. It was a poison. But beneath the jealousy, there was a terrible, aching sense of inadequacy. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused, stained with the dirt of 1,000 days of labor. They were hands made for work, for ropes and branding irons and shovels. They were not hands made for holding a woman like Rose. His mind drifted back 4 years, to the night he had found her. It was in a town called Silverton, a place of mud and desperation. She had been working in a saloon called the Gilded Lily, wearing a dress of cheap satin that had seen too many rough hands. He remembered the bruise blooming on her wrist like a dark flower, the result of a grip from a patron who thought his money bought him the right to break her. Daniel had not been looking for a wife. He had been looking for a warm meal and a quiet corner. But when he saw the terror in her eyes, a raw, animal panic, he had moved before he thought. He remembered the weight of the man hitting the floor after Daniel's fist connected with his jaw. He remembered the way Rose had looked at him, not with love, but with the desperate calculation of a drowning woman seeing a piece of driftwood. She had clung to him that night as if he were the last rope over a cliff. He had brought her here to save her. He had given her his name to shield her from the whispers. But now, sitting in the dark, he realized he had never asked her if she wanted to be saved, or if she simply wanted to be seen. He had treated her like the ranch, something to be protected, fenced in, and maintained. He had not realized that a woman, like the land, needed more than just fences to thrive. The wind rattled the door latch, and Daniel flinched. The memory of her clinging to him made the betrayal cut deeper, a serrated edge dragging across his heart. But it also reminded him of her strength. She was a survivor. If she turned to Eli, it was because she was starving, and Daniel had offered her nothing but dry bread and silence. Morning came with a gray, reluctant light. Daniel rose from the table, his joints stiff, his eyes gritty. He washed his face in the basin, the water cold and shocking. When Rose came into the kitchen, she looked pale, dark circles bruising the skin beneath her eyes. She moved around him carefully, like a cat navigating a room full of rocking chairs. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice tight. Daniel did not look at her. He pulled his hat low. "I will get some at the bunkhouse." He walked out into the yard, leaving her standing there with the pot in her hand. The rejection was small, but it struck its mark. Outside, the air was already thick with heat. Eli was by the barn, saddling the bay mare. He looked up when Daniel approached, his expression guarded. "Morning, boss," Eli said. Daniel stopped a few feet away. He looked at the younger man, the handsome face, the easy way he stood, the charm that hung off him like a loose coat. He wanted to strike him. He wanted to tear him apart. But he clamped his jaws shut until his teeth ached. "Check the south fence," Daniel said, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "The posts are leaning." Eli nodded slowly, sensing the violence radiating from Daniel. "Right. I will get to it." Daniel turned his back on him and walked toward the corral, his hands trembling with the effort of not drawing his gun. By midday, the heat was a physical weight. Daniel was working on the windmill, greasing the gears that shrieked in the wind. When a rider approached, it was a courier from the bank, a boy of no more than 20 who looked terrified to be out in this country. He handed Daniel a sealed envelope and rode off without a word, as if fearing the bad luck of the ranch might be contagious. Daniel tore open the envelope. The paper was crisp, white, and official. Notice of impending foreclosure. The words swam before his eyes. If the remaining balance was not paid by the end of the season, the bank would seize the land, the house, and the herd. Daniel crumpled the paper in his fist. He looked out at the parched fields. He had worked this land for 15 years. He had bled into this soil, and now it was slipping through his fingers like dry sand. The humiliation was a hot flush that started at his neck and burned up to his ears. He was losing his home. He was losing his wife, and the man who was stealing his wife was the same man he was paying to fix his fences. The logic twisted in his mind. Eli was no longer just a ranch hand or a rival. He became the embodiment of everything that was going wrong. Eli was the thief. He had stolen Rose's smiles. He had stolen the peace of the house. And now, he stood there as a reminder of Daniel's failure, a young, vibrant man against a broken, aging rancher. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black. Storm clouds were building again, heavy and sullen, refusing to rain. Daniel saddled his horse. He checked the cinches, pulling them tight. He felt a cold clarity settle over him. He could not fix the bank. He could not fix the rain, but he could fix this. He rode out toward the south fence, toward the shallow wash where the creek used to run. He knew Eli would be there. He found him near the edge of the wash, hammering a staple into a cedar post. The sound of the hammer strikes echoed in the stillness. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Eli stopped when he saw Daniel approaching. He lowered the hammer, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. The two men stared at each other. The wind whipped the tails of their coats. The air smelled of ozone and dry sage. "Finished?" Daniel asked. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of a loaded weapon. "Just about," Eli said. He rested his hand on his hip, near the holster of his Colt revolver. It was an unconscious movement, but Daniel tracked it. Daniel dismounted. He dropped the reins, letting his horse graze on the dry scrub. He walked toward Eli, stopping 5 paces away. "Are you planning to stay?" "Eli?" Daniel asked. Eli narrowed his eyes. "The season is not over. You paid me through the month. I am asking if you plan to stay," Daniel repeated, stepping closer. "Or if you plan to take what is not yours and run." Eli stiffened. He dropped the hammer. It fell into the dust with a dull thud. "I do not know what you are talking about. Daniel, do not lie to me," Daniel said, his voice rising, cracking with the pressure he had held back for days. "I saw you, in the corral. I saw the way you look at her. I heard you." Eli looked away, toward the purple horizon. He did not deny it. The silence was an admission. "She is my wife," Daniel spat. "She is a woman." Eli shot back, his gaze snapping back to Daniel, sudden and fierce. "A woman you keep in that house like a piece of furniture. You do not see her. Daniel, you never have." "I saved her life," Daniel roared. "I pulled her out of the gutter. You pulled her out of one gutter and put her in a lonely box," Eli shouted, stepping forward. "You think feeding her is enough? You think putting a roof over her head is love? She is dying inside that house. She is lonely. Daniel! And you are too busy counting your cows to notice that she cries when she thinks no one is listening." The words hit Daniel like physical blows. They found the cracks in his armor, the guilt, the fear, the knowledge that he was a silent, hard man who did not know how to speak the language of the heart. "You son of a bitch," Daniel growled. He shoved Eli. It was a hard, clumsy shove, born of rage. Eli stumbled back, his boots slipping on the loose stones of the washbank. He regained his balance, his face twisting with anger. "You let them treat her like dirt in town," Eli yelled. "You let those old biddies shame her. And you say nothing. You are a coward. Daniel!" Daniel saw red. The world narrowed down to Eli's face, to the mouth that was speaking truths Daniel could not bear to hear. He lunged. They grappled. It was not a duel of honor. It was a desperate, messy struggle. They grabbed at coats, at arms, grunting with effort. The wind howled around them, drowning out the sound of their boots scraping the rock. Eli was younger, faster. He shoved Daniel back. Daniel stumbled, his hand going to his belt. Eli saw the movement. Fear flashed in his eyes, the fear of a soldier who remembers the suddenness of death. His hand went to his own gun. It was a reflex, a spasm of panic and pride. "Don't!" Daniel shouted. The gun flashed in Eli's fist. Daniel lunged forward, grabbing Eli's wrist. He twisted it, trying to force the barrel away. The gun went off. Crack! The sound was deafening. A sharp slap against the eardrums. The shot went wild, sparking off a rock near their feet. Daniel's horse reared and bolted, galloping away into the darkness. They were locked together, stumbling toward the edge of the wash. The bank was steep, eroded by years of flash floods. The earth crumbled under their boots. They fell. They tumbled down the slope in a tangle of limbs and dust. They hit the bottom of the dry creek bed hard. Daniel landed on his side, the breath knocked out of him. He scrambled to his knees, gasping, looking for Eli. Eli was lying 5 feet away. He was on his back. His eyes were open, staring up at the bruised sky. "Eli?" Daniel rasped. Eli did not move. Daniel crawled over to him. The dust was settling around them. "Get up! Eli!" He reached out and touched Eli's shoulder. There was no resistance. He looked closer. Beneath Eli's head, a dark stain was spreading into the thirsty earth, black in the twilight. He had struck his temple on a jagged piece of quartz that jutted from the creek bed. Or perhaps the gun had gone off again in the tumble. Daniel couldn't remember hearing a second shot, but his ears were ringing. It didn't matter. Daniel put his hand on Eli's chest. The heart was still. The chest was silent. "Oh, God," Daniel whispered. He sat back on his heels, his hands trembling violently. Oh, God. The silence of the plains rushed back in, heavy and absolute. The wind had died down, as if holding its breath. The only sound was Daniel's own ragged breathing. He looked at the body. A moment ago, this had been a man, vibrant, angry, alive. Now it was just meat and bone. Daniel felt a wave of nausea. He bent over and dry heaved into the dust. He stood up, his legs shaking. What had he done? He hadn't meant to kill him. He had just wanted him to leave. He had just wanted him to stop talking. Panic seized him. He looked around wildly. No one was there. The plains were empty, but the law was out there. The sheriff, Luke, Eli's brother, who lived 2 towns over. If he went to the sheriff, what would happen? A jealous husband, a dead lover, a shot fired. They would hang him. He would swing from a rope in the town square, and the women who hated Rose would watch with satisfaction. And Rose would have to testify. She would have to stand up in court and tell the world about the affair. She would be dragged through the mud, branded publicly, destroyed. And the ranch? The bank would take it immediately. Rose would be left alone, a widow with a ruined reputation and no home. Turned out onto the street. He could not let that happen. Daniel looked down at Eli. "I am sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. He could not go to the sheriff. He had to finish this. He dragged the body. It was heavy, dead weight in the truest sense. He dragged Eli further down the wash, to a spot where the bank curved and a lone, gnarled cottonwood tree stood sentinel. Its roots were exposed, twisting like snakes into the dry earth. He did not have a shovel on his saddle. His horse was gone anyway. He found a piece of driftwood, a flat, sturdy board washed down from the mountains years ago. He fell to his knees and began to dig. The ground was like iron. It fought him. Daniel dug with the wood until it splintered. Then he dug with his hands. He clawed at the rocks and the hard-packed clay. His fingernails tore. His knuckles bled. He wept as he dug, hot tears mixing with the dust on his face. He dug a shallow grave, deep enough to hide the truth, but shallow enough that the guilt would always be near the surface. Coyotes began to yip in the distance, a high, mocking laughter. They smelled death. Daniel pulled Eli into the hole. He paused, looking at the young man's face one last time. He reached down and closed Eli's eyes. "I did not want this," Daniel said to the dead man. "I swear it." He pushed the dirt back in. He piled stones on top to keep the scavengers away. He scattered dry brush over the stones to hide the disturbance. By the time he was finished, the moon had risen, casting a pale, ghostly light over the wash. Daniel stood up. He was covered in dirt and blood. Some his, some Eli's. He felt hollowed out, as if his insides had been scooped away. He began the long walk back to the ranch house. His horse had likely run home. He walked for miles, his boots dragging. When he reached the house, it was near dawn. The windows were dark. He went to the water trough and stripped off his shirt. He scrubbed his skin with the freezing water, shivering violently. He washed the blood from his hands, but he knew the stain would never truly come out. He put on a clean shirt from the line, burying the dirty one at the bottom of the trash burn pile. He walked into the kitchen. Rose was sitting at the table. She had not slept. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide and fearful. "Daniel," she said, "where is Eli?" His horse came back alone. Daniel stopped. He leaned against the doorframe, needing the support. He looked at his wife. He saw the worry in her eyes. Worry for Eli. "He rode off," Daniel said. His voice was flat. "Dead." "Rode off?" Rose asked, standing up. "What do you mean?" "We argued," Daniel said. "He looked at the floor, about his wages. He wanted more money. I told him I didn't have it. He said he was wasting his time here. He took his pay and he left, said he was heading for California." Rose stared at him. The color drained from her face. "He just left, without saying goodbye?" He didn't care. Rose! Daniel lied, the words tasting like ash. He had no loyalty. He was just passing through. Rose swayed slightly. She gripped the back of the chair. No, she whispered. He wouldn't. He did, Daniel said harshly. He is gone. He saw the light go out in her eyes. He saw the pain twist her features. A sharp, physical agony. She believed him, or at least, she couldn't imagine the alternative. She believed that Eli, the man who had held her and promised her he chose her, had abandoned her over a handful of dollars. She did not cry, not in front of him. She pressed her lips together, turning her face away. I see, she said, her voice brittle. She walked past him into the bedroom and closed the door. Daniel stood alone in the kitchen. He had saved her from the truth, but he had broken her heart to do it. The days that followed were a blur of gray heat and silence. The ranch felt vast and empty without Eli's whistling, without his movement. In town, the rumors started. Someone had seen a rider heading west. Someone else said Eli Ward owed money to a card shark in Tucson. The story Daniel had planted took root. He skipped out. The men at the general store said, just like a drifter. Rose became a ghost. She moved through the house with mechanical precision. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended, but she was not there. Her eyes were always focused on something far away. She lost weight. The silence between her and Daniel was no longer just tension. It was a chasm, filled with the wreckage of their marriage and the body of a dead man. She never mentioned his name again, but Daniel saw her watching the road, waiting for a rider who would never come. Daniel threw himself into the work. He worked until his muscles screamed, trying to exhaust himself so he wouldn't dream. But the guilt was a stone in his gut that he could not digest. He avoided the wash. He rode miles out of his way to avoid the lone cottonwood, but the tree exerted a gravitational pull. Some nights, when the moon was hidden, Daniel would saddle his horse and ride out there. He would sit on his horse in the darkness, listening to the wind rattle the dry leaves of the cottonwood. He would look at the pile of stones and brush. I am sorry, he would whisper to the earth. I am sorry. He would sit there for hours, a sentinel over his own crime, while the coyotes howled and the guilt hardened inside him, layer by layer, turning his heart into something as dry and dead as the plains around him. He had buried the lover, but he had not buried the love. He had only buried himself. The dawn arrived not with light, but with a creeping gray cold that seeped through the timber walls of the ranch house. Daniel Crow woke with a start, the air in the room biting at his exposed face. He reached out instinctively, his hands seeking the warmth of his wife's body, but his fingers met only cold linen. He sat up, his heart hammering a sudden, erratic rhythm against his ribs. The space beside him was empty. The quilt was thrown back, and the sheet was smooth and chilled, suggesting she had been gone for some time. Rose, he called out, his voice rough with sleep. The only answer was the wind. It rattled the loose shutter against the window frame, a hollow, wooden clatter that sounded like dry bones knocking together. The silence of the house was heavy, distinct from the usual quiet of the morning. It was a silence that felt abandoned. Daniel threw off the covers and pulled on his trousers and boots, his movements frantic. A sick feeling uncoiled in his stomach, cold and heavy. He checked the kitchen. The stove was cold, the water in the basin untouched. Her coat was missing from the peg by the door. His mind raced to the darkest places. He thought of the creek, swollen with the recent seasonal shifts but still dangerously cold. He thought of the despair that had etched lines around her mouth in the week since Eli had vanished. Had she finally broken? Had the silence and the isolation become too much? He grabbed his coat and hat, bursting out the front door into the biting air. The frost lay thick on the ground, turning the brown grass into a field of silver needles. He scanned the yard. The horses were huddling in the corral, their breath steaming in the air. But the bay mare, the gentle one Rose favored, was gone. He ran to the tack room. Her saddle was missing. Daniel saddled his own horse with trembling hands, the leather stiff and unyielding in the cold. He mounted and rode out, his eyes scanning the ground for tracks. The frost held the hoofprints clearly, dark half-moons cut into the silver crust. He followed them, his chest tight. He feared they would lead south, toward the dry wash and the lone cottonwood where the truth lay buried under a pile of stones. If she had found the grave, if she had sensed the disturbance in the earth, everything was over. But the tracks did not turn south. They led east, toward town. Daniel spurred his horse, confusion warring with relief. Why town? Was she running away? Was she catching the stagecoach to leave him? To go back to the life she had fled? Or to find a new one where no one knew her name? He rode hard, the wind whipping tears from his eyes. The landscape was bleak, the skeleton of the country showing through the thinning grass. He tracked her for an hour, the trail leading away from the ranch and up toward the rise that overlooked the settlement of Blackwood. The tracks veered off the main road before reaching the town proper. They wound up a narrow, weed-choked path that led to the top of a wind-swept hill, the cemetery. Daniel slowed his horse as he crested the ridge. The cemetery was a pitiful patch of ground, a collection of crooked wooden crosses and a few leaning headstones enclosed by a rotting picket fence. It was a place for the town's forgotten and for those who had died hard deaths on the frontier. He saw her. She was there, near the edge of the burial ground, where the grass gave way to scrub oak and sage. She was on her knees in the dirt, her dark coat pooled around her. She was clinging to a rough wooden marker, her forehead pressed against the wood. Daniel dismounted 100 yards away, tying his horse in a cluster of juniper that hid him from view. He crept closer on foot, moving silently through the brush, the skills of a hunter taking over despite the turmoil in his soul. He stopped behind the trunk of a twisted oak, close enough to hear the wind snapping the fabric of her dress, close enough to hear her voice. She was sobbing. It was a sound that tore through the cold air, raw, jagged sobs that shook her small frame. "I am sorry," she gasped, her voice breaking. "Oh God, Eli, I am so sorry." Daniel froze. His hand gripped the rough bark of the oak tree. She was mourning him. But as he looked closer, his eyes narrowing, he realized where she was kneeling. She was not at the edge of his land. She was not at the cottonwood. She was crying over a mound of earth that had been there for 6 months. It was the grave of a drifter, a nameless ranch hand from the Bar T outfit who had been trampled in a stampede and buried by the town because he had no kin to claim him. Someone had stuck a piece of broken crate wood at the head of the grave. In her grief, in her desperate need for closure, Rose had convinced herself that this forgotten patch of earth belonged to Eli. "They said you left." She wept, her fingers digging into the dirt of the grave. "Daniel said you took your pay and rode off. But I know you would not have left me without a word. You are here. I can feel you here." She was rewriting the story, filling the silence Daniel had created with her own tragic ending. She believed Eli had died, perhaps on the road, perhaps in some accident, and had been brought here. Or perhaps she simply needed a physical place to put her pain, and this nameless grave was the only vessel that would hold it. "I should have gone with you," she whispered, her voice dropping to a painful rasp. "We should have run away that night in the barn." Daniel closed his eyes, the words stinging like a lash. "But I was too afraid," she continued, her voice trembling. "I was afraid to leave him." She paused, lifting her head to look at the blank wood of the marker. "And I loved him. Eli, that is the sin of it. I loved you for making me feel alive, but I loved him for keeping me safe. I loved him because he is the only solid thing in this world, even if he is as hard as a rock." Daniel's breath hitched in his throat. He opened his eyes, staring at his wife's back. He had expected anger. He had expected hatred. He had not expected this confused, tortured confession of love for the man who had murdered her lover. "I am so lost," she whispered, slumping forward again. "I am so lost. I tried to be a good wife. I tried to be a good woman, but I destroy everything I touch." She stayed there for a long time, the wind pulling at her hair, her tears watering the dry soil of a stranger's grave. Daniel stood hidden in the shadows, his chest torn open. The irony was a physical weight, crushing him. She was pouring her heart out to a box of bones that meant nothing, while the man she mourned lay rotting in a shallow wash on Daniel's own land, buried by Daniel's own hands. He wanted to step forward. He wanted to pull her up from the dirt and tell her everything. He wanted to scream that he was the monster, not her, but shame pinned him to the spot. He could not destroy the fragile reality she had constructed. He could not look her in the eye and tell her that Eli was not resting in hallowed ground, but was hidden like a shameful secret. Finally, Rose stood up. She wiped her face with her hands, her movements slow and weary. She smoothed her dress, regaining a shred of that rigid composure she used as armor. She walked back to her horse, mounted, and rode slowly down the hill toward the ranch, never looking back. Daniel waited until she was a small speck on the road before he stepped out from the trees. He walked to the grave she had chosen. He looked down at the marker. It was a piece of pine board, gray and splintered. Faintly, scrawled in charcoal that was nearly washed away by the rain, were the initials J.D., just a drifter, just a nobody. Daniel stared at the mound. He felt a deep, profound loneliness. Rose was mourning a ghost. She was trapped in a lie he had built, and now she was building her own lies on top of it just to survive. He walked back to his horse, his boots heavy as lead. The ride back to the ranch felt colder than the ride out. The land seemed stripped of color. The cattle on the hills looked like skeletons. The sky was turning a bruised, sullen purple in the north. A storm was coming. Not just wind and dust this time, but winter. He knew as the ranch house came into view, sitting small and isolated against the vast horizon, that he could not live with this lie much longer. It was poisoning the air they breathed. It was turning his wife into a mourner of strangers and him into a jailer of the truth. He arrived back at the barn an hour after her. He took his time unsaddling the horse, rubbing the animal down with straw, delaying the moment he would have to face her. When he finally entered the house, the warmth of the stove hit him, but it did not thaw the chill in his bones. Rose was at the sink, washing dishes. Her back was to him. She had taken off her coat, but she still wore the plain gray dress she had worn to the cemetery. Her shoulders were tense. "I woke up and you were gone," Daniel said quietly, hanging his hat on the peg. Rose did not turn. "I went for a ride," she said. Her voice was steady, but it was thin, like ice over deep water. "I needed air. It is cold out," Daniel said. "Yes, it is." She continued scrubbing a plate, the rhythm mechanical. Daniel watched her. He saw the redness around her eyes, the puffiness that betrayed her tears. He took a step toward her. He wanted to tell her he knew. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. He reached out and touched her wrist, his rough fingers wrapping around the delicate bones. Rose flinched. It was a sharp, instinctive jerk, as if his touch burned. She pulled her arm back, clutching the wet plate to her chest. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide and guarded, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Daniel froze, his hands suspended in the air. For a moment, they just looked at one another, two people sharing a small room and a massive secret. Then, slowly, the tension in Rose's shoulders dropped an inch. She saw something in his face. Perhaps it was the exhaustion. Perhaps it was the naked pain he could no longer hide. She lowered the plate into the water. She did not step away. She placed her wet hand on the edge of the basin, leaving it there, within his reach. Daniel lowered his hand, covering hers again. This time, she did not pull away. His skin was calloused and scarred. Hers was red from the hot water and the cold wind. The touch sent a painful warmth through him, a connection that bridged the silence for the first time in months. "Supper will be ready soon," she whispered, looking down at their hands. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you." He squeezed her hand once, gently, then let go and walked to the fire to warm himself, leaving her to her secrets. The storm hit 2 days later. It came screaming down from the mountains, a white wall of fury that buried the plains in hours. The temperature plummeted. The wind howled against the logs of the cabin, sounding like a pack of wolves trying to tear the structure apart. Snow piled up against the windows, sealing them into a gray, twilight world. They were cut off. The road to town was impassable. The cattle were huddled in the draws, fending for themselves. Daniel and Rose were trapped in the small house, forced into a proximity they had avoided for months. The cabin fever set in quickly. The air inside grew heavy and thick. They moved around each other in the small kitchen and the single bedroom, a dangerous dance of avoidance. Every accidental brush of a shoulder, every time they had to squeeze past each other near the stove. The air crackled with electricity. It was charged with grief, with anger, and with a buried, stubborn desire that refused to die. Daniel spent hours staring into the fire, whittling a piece of wood into shavings just to keep his hands busy. Rose mended the same shirt 3 times. The wind never stopped screaming. On the 3rd night, the tension broke. Rose was sitting by the hearth, the firelight casting dancing shadows on her face. She had been silent all day, her mood darkening as the storm raged. Suddenly, she threw the shirt she was mending onto the floor. "It is never going to end," she said, her voice rising. Daniel looked up, startled. "The storm will pass. Rose, it always does." "I am not talking about the storm," she cried. She stood up, pacing the small space in front of the fire. "I am talking about this, about us, about this curse." "Curse?" Daniel asked, setting down his knife. "I am cursed. Daniel," she said, turning to him, her eyes wild in the firelight. "Look at me. I came from nothing. I sold myself for whiskey money in a mining camp. And then you came. You saved me. And I thought I could be clean." She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "But the town knows. They look at me and they see dirt. And they are right. Because I am poison." "Daniel, Rose, stop!" Daniel said, standing up. "No!" she shouted. "I let another man into our life. I let him touch me. And now he is gone. He abandoned me because I was not worth staying for. Every man who touches me ends up ruined or leaves. I am dead inside. Daniel, I have been walking around this house for months, but I am already dead." She was shaking, her hands gripping her hair. She looked shattered, a woman broken by the weight of her own perceived worthlessness. Daniel watched her, and the dam inside him finally burst. The control he had maintained for years, the stoicism that he wore like a shield, shattered. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip hard. "You are not cursed," he said, his voice shaking with an intensity that silenced the wind outside. "I am," she sobbed, trying to pull away. "I am a whore, just like they say." "No!" Daniel shouted, giving her a small shake. "You are not. You are the only thing in this life that is real." He stared down at her, his chest heaving. "Listen to me. Rose, I did not save you. You survived. You survived that saloon. You survived this ranch. You survived me." He let go of her shoulders and ran a hand over his face, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "I failed you. I brought you here and I left you alone. I buried myself in the work because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Rose whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Afraid that I was not enough," Daniel said, the confession tearing out of him. "I am a hard man. Rose, I look at the ground. I count cattle. I do not know how to speak pretty words. I thought if I worked myself to death, if I built you a fortress, that would be enough. But I just built a prison." He looked at her, his eyes wet. "You are not an obligation. You never were. You are the only soft thing I have ever known. You are the only thing that makes this God-forsaken dust worth fighting for." Rose stared at him. She had never heard him speak this way. She had never seen him stripped bare of his pride. "Daniel," she breathed. She took a step toward him. The space between them, filled for so long with lies and ghosts, suddenly collapsed. She reached out and grabbed the lapels of his coat. He reached for her waist. They collided. The kiss was not gentle. It was fierce. It was aching. It was a collision of 2 people who were starving, who had been hurt and had hurt each other, but who were desperate to find solid ground. Rose kissed him with a frantic energy, tasting the salt of her own tears and the taste of him, familiar, grounded, hers. Daniel held her as if the wind would blow her away if he let go, burying his hands in her hair, pulling her closer until there was no air left between them. It was a reclaiming. It was an erasure of the distance, a physical demand to be seen, to be forgiven, to be held. They stumbled back against the table, the wood groaning. Daniel lifted her, pressing her against the warmth of his body. For a moment, the desire flared hot and consuming, threatening to burn down the house, but then, just as suddenly, they stopped. Daniel pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, both of them gasping for breath. He could feel her heart racing against his chest. He could feel the trembling in her limbs. He wanted her. God, he wanted her. But he could not take her. Not now. Not with the lie still standing in the room with them like a specter. He could not rebuild their marriage on a foundation of deceit. If he took her to bed now, while she still believed Eli was a man who had abandoned her, while she still mourned at the wrong grave, it would be another violation. It would be a theft. Rose looked up at him, her eyes dark and searching, her lips swollen. She was waiting. She was willing. She had chosen him in that cemetery, and she was choosing him now. But Daniel knew that choice had to be made with open eyes. He smoothed her hair back from her face, his touch agonizingly gentle. "Rose," he whispered. She leaned into his hand. Closing her eyes, he held her there in the silence of the kitchen, the fire popping in the grate, the wind screaming outside. He held her until her breathing slowed, until the frantic energy dissipated into a heavy, exhausted comfort. He made a silent vow. The storm would break soon. The snow would stop. And when it did, when the world opened up again, he would take her to the cottonwood. He would tell her about the fight. He would tell her about the grave. He would hand her the power to hate him or forgive him. He would risk losing her forever to win her back for real. "Let us sit by the fire," he said softly. He led her to the chairs. He pulled the quilt from the bed and wrapped it around her shoulders. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. They sat in silence as the night deepened, holding on to each other against the cold, waiting for the storm to pass so the reckoning could begin. The silence that followed the storm was absolute, after days of wind that screamed like a banshee, tearing at the shingles and piling snow against the windows. The world had woken up hushed and blindingly white. The sky was a polished, brittle blue, the sun bright but offering no warmth. The temperature had plummeted, turning the air into something sharp that burned the lungs with every inhalation. Survival became the only thing that mattered. For 2 days, Daniel and Rose moved through the drifts like sleepwalkers, their bodies bent against the cold. The drifts were waist-high in places, burying the fences until only the tops of the posts poked through like jagged teeth. Daniel spent the mornings at the water troughs. They were frozen solid, blocks of iron-hard ice. He swung the axe with grim determination, the metal ringing out across the empty plains. Clang! 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 Shards of ice flew like glass, stinging his face. He had to chop through a foot of freeze just so the cattle, shivering and huddled together for warmth in the lee of the barn, could drink. Their breath rose in thick, white plumes, vanishing into the frigid air. Rose worked just as hard. She hauled feed, her boots crunching through the crust of the snow. She carried buckets of hot water from the stove to the chickens, trying to keep the hens from freezing on their roosts. Her hands, usually so careful, were red and chapped, wrapped in rags inside her mittens. On the second afternoon, they found a calf that had strayed from the herd during the whiteout. It was half buried in a drift near the creek bed, frozen stiff. Daniel tied a rope around its hind legs, and together they dragged it toward the burn pile. It was gruesome work, hauling the dead weight over the snow while their own breath smoked around them. They did not speak. The sheer physical effort required to keep the ranch alive left no room for words. But the silence between them was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a dam about to break. By the third day, the immediate crisis had passed. The path to the barn was cleared. The cattle were fed. The sun was beginning to soften the top layer of snow, making it glisten like diamond dust. Daniel stood by the barn door, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the freezing temperature. He watched Rose coming from the house, a basket of eggs in her hand. She looked exhausted, her face pale against the dark wool of her coat. "Rose," he said. She stopped, looking at him. His voice was different. It lacked the flat, command-like tone he used for ranch business. It was hollow, trembling. "Leave the basket," he said. "Come inside." He turned and walked into the shadowed interior of the barn. Rose hesitated for a heartbeat, a frown creasing her brow, then set the basket on the porch rail and followed him. The barn was warmer than the outside, smelling of sweet hay, manure, and the earthy scent of the horses. It was a smell that usually brought comfort, but today it felt suffocating. Daniel stood in the center of the aisle, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He was not looking at her. He was staring at a patch of ground where the straw was scattered. Rose closed the door, shutting out the glare of the snow. "What is it? Daniel, is there a sick horse?" Daniel turned to face her. He looked older than she had ever seen him. The lines around his mouth were deep gouges. His eyes were rimmed with red. He was shaking, a fine tremor running through his hands that he tried to hide by clenching his fists. "No," he said, "the horses are fine." He took a breath, a ragged sound in the quiet barn. "I have to tell you something," he said. "And when I say it, you are going to hate me. You are going to wish you had never met me." Rose felt a cold prickle of fear at the base of her spine. "Daniel, you are scaring me. I lied to you," he said. His voice cracked, losing its timbre. "About Eli." Rose went still. Her hand went to her throat. "What about him? You said he left. He did not leave." Daniel said, "He never left." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Rose stared at him, her mind trying to process the impossibility of what he was saying. "What do you mean?" she whispered. "He is dead." "Rose." The world seemed to tilt. Rose took a step back, bumping into a support post. "Dead? But how? Did he fall? Was it the storm?" Daniel closed his eyes, unable to bear the confusion in her face. "No, it was me." He opened his eyes and forced himself to look at her. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. "We fought," he said, the words spilling out now in a rush, desperate to be free of him, down by the wash, the day he disappeared. "I knew about you two. I saw you in the corral. I rode out there to tell him to leave, to get off my land." "Daniel, no," Rose breathed, her hands covering her mouth. "He would not go," Daniel continued, his voice monotone, reciting the nightmare. "We argued. He said I didn't deserve you. He said I was keeping you in a cage. We grabbed each other. He had a gun. It went off. We fell into the wash." He looked at his hands, as if he could still see the dust and blood on them. He hit his head, or the gun went off again. I do not know. It happened so fast. But he was dead. Rose made a sound, a high, keen whimper that sounded like a wounded animal. She slid down the post, her knees giving way. "I panicked," Daniel said, stepping toward her but not daring to touch her. "I was afraid. Rose, afraid of the law, afraid of what they would say about you. Afraid you would lose everything. So I buried him." He pointed a shaking finger toward the south wall of the barn, toward the distant property line, under the cottonwood tree, in the wash. "I buried him with my bare hands, and I came back here, and I told you he left." Rose stared up at him from the floor. Her face was a mask of shock, drained of all blood. "You buried him," she whispered. "Yes, and you let me believe." She trailed off, her voice gaining strength, transforming from shock to something hotter. "You let me believe he abandoned me. I thought it was better," Daniel pleaded. "I thought if you hated him, you would move on. Better," she screamed. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes blazing with sudden, terrifying fury. She lunged at him. "You let me think he didn't love me," she shrieked. She slapped Daniel across the face, a hard, cracking blow that snapped his head to the side. He did not defend himself. He stood there and took it. "You let me wake up every morning thinking I was nothing to him. She hit his chest with her fists, pounding against his heavy coat. "You stole my grief! You stole my goodbye! Rose, please!" Daniel gasped, catching her wrists as she tried to scratch his face. "You murderer!" she screamed, struggling against his grip. "You liar! You stood there and watched me! You watched me wait for him!" "I watched you cry over the wrong grave," Daniel shouted back, his own control snapping. Rose froze. Her chest heaved. "I saw you," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a tortured whisper. "At the cemetery, crying over that drifter, begging a stranger for forgiveness because you thought it was him. It killed me. Rose, seeing you break your heart over a piece of wood while the man you loved was rotting in a ditch because of me." I could not do it anymore. Rose pulled her hands from his grip. She backed away, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She looked at him with a mixture of horror and revulsion. "You are a monster," she hissed. "Maybe," Daniel said, "but I am done lying. I hate you," she said, the tears finally spilling over. "I hate you." She turned and ran out of the barn. "Rose!" Daniel shouted. He chased her into the yard. The sun was blinding off the snow. She was running toward the gate, though there was nowhere to go, nowhere to run to in this buried world. She spun around near the water trough, cornered by the vastness of the white plains. "Why did you do it?" she screamed, her voice carrying on the wind. "Why couldn't you just let us go?" "Because you are my wife," Daniel yelled, closing the distance. "Because I loved you. You have a strange way of showing it," Rose cried. "You never spoke to me. You never looked at me. You treated me like a prize you won in a fight, something to put on a shelf and keep clean. I treated you like the only good thing I ever had." Daniel fired back, the veins in his neck standing out. "I was terrified. Rose, look at you. You are beautiful and you are sharp and you are alive. And look at me. I am dirt and calluses and silence. I knew it was only a matter of time before you saw that, before you realized you were better than this place. Better than me." He stopped, panting, his breath smoking in the cold air. "I pushed you away because I was afraid to get close," he said, his voice breaking. "Because I knew if I let myself love you the way I wanted to, and then you left, it would destroy me. So I let the town judge you. I let the silence grow. And I let another man take my place because I was too much of a coward to fight for you until it was too late." Rose stared at him, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The anger was still there, hot and fierce, but beneath it, the shock was giving way to understanding. "You made me feel small." "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "Eli made me feel seen. He looked at me, and he didn't see a saloon girl. He saw a woman. I see you," Daniel said, stepping forward, his hands open. "I see you, Rose. I see all of it. The way you hum when you cook, the way you hate the wind, the way you are stronger than any man I have ever known. I see you." They stood there in the snow, 10 feet apart, stripped bare. The truth was out, ugly and bloody and raw. There were no more secrets, just the wreckage of 3 lives scattered around them. Rose looked at him, shivering violently. She did not know if she wanted to kill him or collapse into his arms. Before she could speak, a sound cut through the wind. Riders. They appeared on the ridgeline, dark silhouettes against the blinding white of the hill. 3 of them. They moved slowly, their horses high-stepping through the drifts. Daniel turned. He squinted against the glare. He recognized the lead horse. It was a big roan gelding that belonged to the sheriff. And beside him, riding a black stallion that looked mean and tired, was a man with the same slope to his shoulders as Eli, Luke Ward, Eli's older brother. The tension in the yard snapped from private to public in the space of a heartbeat. The reality of the law, of consequences, crashed down on them. Rose looked at Daniel. Her face was pale. She knew what this meant. Daniel looked at the riders, then back at Rose. He saw the fear in her eyes. He saw the conflict. And in that moment, he made his choice. He would not ask her to lie for him. He would not ask her to carry this burden 1 second longer. "Stay here," he said softly. The riders rode into the yard, the snow crunching loudly under the hooves. They pulled up near the porch. The sheriff was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and weary eyes. Luke Ward was lean, wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He had Eli's eyes, but without the warmth. "Crow." The sheriff nodded. "Sheriff," Daniel said. He stood his ground, his hands hanging loose by his sides. "We finally made it through the drifts." The sheriff said, "This is Luke Ward. He has come a long way looking for his brother. We heard talk in town that Eli left your employ somewhat suddenly." Luke leaned forward in his saddle, his hand resting on his thigh near his gun. "Where is he? Crow. I know my brother. He doesn't just run off without collecting his debts. And I know he was sweet on your wife," Rose gasped. Luke's eyes flicked to her, cold and accusing. Daniel stepped in front of Rose, blocking Luke's line of sight. "He is not here," Daniel said. "Where did he go?" Luke demanded. "He didn't go anywhere," Daniel said. His voice was calm, steady. The calm of a man who has stopped running. The sheriff straightened up. "What do you mean? Daniel?" Daniel looked the sheriff in the eye. "He is dead. Jim." The silence that fell over the yard was heavier than the snow. "Dead?" the sheriff asked, his hand drifting to his holster. "There was a fight," Daniel said, "down by the wash, 6 weeks ago. It was an accident, but he is dead." "You killed him," Luke snarled. His hand flashed to his gun. "Easy," the sheriff shouted, drawing his own weapon and pointing it at Luke. "Keep your hands where I can see them." "Ward." Luke froze, his hand hovering over his pistol. His face was twisted in a rictus of hate. "You murdered him." "Crow! You jealous son of a bitch." "It was self-defense," Daniel said, though he knew how hollow it sounded. "But I buried him. I hid the body. That is a crime." "Daniel," the sheriff said heavily, "even if it was self-defense, concealing a death, that is bad." "I know," Daniel said. He held out his hands. "I am done hiding it. Get down off that horse." "Luke," the sheriff ordered, "keep your hands clear. Daniel, you turn around." Rose stood frozen as the scene unfolded. She watched the sheriff dismount, taking a pair of iron shackles from his saddlebag. She watched Daniel turn around, offering his wrists. The click of the metal locking was the loudest sound in the world. Luke dismounted, spitting into the snow near Daniel's boots. "You are going to hang for this. Crow. And after you swing, I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of woman you were protecting." He looked at Rose with a sneer that made her skin crawl. A faithless whore and a murderer. Quite a pair. Daniel lunged, shoulder-checking Luke, but the sheriff grabbed him. "That is enough," the sheriff barked. "Luke, you shut your mouth or I will lock you up too. Daniel, get in the saddle. We are going to town." Rose took a step forward, the snow soaking through her thin shoes. "Daniel!" Daniel looked back at her. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear. There was no fear in them, only a deep, sad resignation. "Go inside. Rose," he said, "it is cold, but it is over," he said. He awkwardly mounted his horse with his hands bound. The sheriff took the reins. Luke remounted, his eyes burning holes into Daniel's back. They turned and rode out of the yard, a somber procession of black coats against the white snow. Rose stood there, shivering, watching them go until they disappeared over the ridge. The house behind her felt vast. It felt empty. The silence came rushing back. But this time, it was the silence of a tomb. She was alone, truly alone. The news hit the town of Blackwood like a spark in a hayloft. By the time the sheriff brought Daniel in, half the town was watching from the boardwalks. By evening, the story had mutated and spread into every parlor and saloon. The rancher had killed the lover in cold blood. The wife was an adulteress who had lured the young man to his death. Rose rode into town the next day. She had to. She could not stay in that empty house with the ghosts. When she walked down the street, the reaction was visceral. Women she had known for 4 years turned their backs. Men stopped talking and stared with open, lewd curiosity. She heard the whispers. Always knew she was trouble. Blood on her hands as much as his. Devil in a dress. She kept her head high, though her insides were churning with nausea. She went straight to the sheriff's office. "Sheriff," she said, marching through the door. The sheriff looked up from his desk. Daniel was in the cell in the back. Rose could see him through the bars, sitting on the cot, his head in his hands. "Mrs. Crow," the sheriff said, sighing. "You shouldn't be here. The town is not friendly right now." "I do not care about the town," Rose said, her voice shaking but firm. "I want to testify." The sheriff frowned. "Testify? Rose, you don't have to do that. You can stay out of it. If you get up on that stand, Luke Ward's lawyer is going to tear you apart. He's going to drag your past out for everyone to see." "I know," Rose said. "They are going to say you slept with Eli. They are going to say you wanted him dead." "I know," she repeated. "Then why?" "Because," Rose said, looking past the sheriff to the man in the cell, "because Daniel did not kill him in cold blood, and Eli was not an innocent angel. And if I do not tell the truth, no one will." She took a breath. "I am the cause of this. Sheriff, I will not let him hang for my sins." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Mrs. Crow. The hearing is in 3 days." Rose walked back to the cell. She gripped the cold iron bars. Daniel stood up and walked over. He looked tired, bruised from the ride. "Go home." "Rose," he whispered. "Do not do this. I am not going anywhere," she said. "You heard Luke. They will destroy you. Let them," she said. "I am done being afraid of them." She reached through the bars. He hesitated, then took her hand. His grip was strong, desperate. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I know," he said. That night, Rose returned to the ranch. She walked into the bedroom. It was freezing. She lit the lamp and sat on the edge of the bed. She ran her hand over the empty pillow where Daniel usually slept. She smelled the scent of him, leather, dust, and pine soap. She thought of Eli. She thought of his smile, his charm, the way he had made her heart race. But now, in the cold light of the aftermath, it felt like a fever dream. It was a fantasy, a bright, shiny escape from a hard reality. But Daniel was the reality. He was the wood in the stove. He was the fence against the wind. He was the man who had buried a body to save her from shame, and who had confessed to a crime to save her from a lie. She realized, with a sudden, aching clarity, that she loved him, not with the flighty, desperate passion she had felt for Eli, but with something harder, something forged in survival and stubbornness. She curled up on his side of the bed, pulling his pillow against her chest, and finally wept. Not for Eli, but for the time they had wasted, and for the fear that she had realized the truth too late. In the jail cell, Daniel sat staring at his knuckles. He expected to hang. Luke Ward had money and anger, and the town wanted a hanging. A jealous husband killing a younger man was a story that usually ended with a rope. He made his peace with it. He had taken a life, accident or not. He had covered it up. He had to pay, but he would not leave Rose with nothing. He called for the sheriff. "Jim," he said when the lawman came back. "Yeah, Daniel, I need to sign some papers." Daniel said, When this goes bad, I want the ranch transferred to Rose. Fully. And I have some money buried in a tin box under the floorboards of the smokehouse. It is not much, but it will pay off the bank interest for another season." The sheriff looked at him sadly. "You think it's going to go that way?" Daniel looked at the small, barred window, where the snow was still falling softly. "Luke wants blood," Daniel said, "and I am tired of fighting. Jim, just make sure she gets the land. Make sure she is free of the debt. I will draw it up," the sheriff said. Daniel leaned back against the stone wall. He closed his eyes and thought of the cottonwood tree. He hoped Eli was at peace, and he hoped, more than anything, that Rose would find a way to live in the spring, even if he wasn't there to see it. The hearings were held in the town hall, a drafty structure of raw pine that served as a courthouse when the circuit judge rode through. It was a Tuesday, but the room was packed as if it were a revival meeting. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the muddy slush that coated the boots of every man in Blackwood. The winter light slanted in through the high, frosted windows, pale and unforgiving. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the cold air and cast long, harsh shadows across the faces of the townsfolk. They squeezed onto the rough benches, murmuring to one another, their eyes hungry for the spectacle. This was not just a trial to them, it was a theater of morality. And they had come to see the final act of a tragedy they had all whispered about for months. Daniel Crow sat at a small table near the front. He wore his best coat, though it was threadbare at the cuffs, and his hands were manacled in iron. He sat still, his posture rigid, staring at the scarred wood of the table. He looked like a man who had already accepted his fate. Across the aisle, Luke Ward sat like a stone statue. He was Eli's brother, a hard man with a face weathered by wind and bitterness. He did not look at the judge. He looked at Daniel, his eyes burning with a cold, murderous promise. Behind him, the church women, Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Higgins among them, huddled like crows on a fence line, their whispers creating a low, buzzing hum of judgment. Judge Holloway was a man weary from 20 years of frontier bloodshed. He had seen cattle thieves, murderers, and claim jumpers, and he had little patience for crimes of passion. He sat behind the raised bench, shuffling the papers the sheriff had provided, his face unreadable. Sheriff Jim stood up to present the facts. He spoke plainly, his voice echoing in the hush. He detailed the disappearance of Eli Ward, the discovery of the hidden grave in the dry wash, and Daniel's confession. He laid it out as it appeared on the surface: a jealous husband, a younger lover, a confrontation in the wilderness, and a body buried in secret. It looks bad, Daniel thought, closing his eyes. It looks like murder. The judge looked over his spectacles at Daniel. You admit to burying the man, Mr. Crow? Yes, sir, Daniel said, his voice low but steady. And you admit to killing him? I admit there was a struggle, and he died, Daniel said. A murmur went through the crowd. Luke Ward shifted in his seat, his boots scraping loudly against the floorboards. Then the bailiff called Rose Crow. The room went silent. Every head turned as the double doors at the back opened. Rose stood there, silhouetted against the blinding white snow outside. She wore her plain gray dress, the one she had mended a dozen times. She held her head high, but Daniel could see the tremor in her hands as she clutched her shawl. She walked down the center aisle. It was a gauntlet. The stairs were physical things, heavy and sharp. She could feel the judgment radiating from the benches, the sneers of the men, the self-righteous glares of the women who had called her a whore in the general store. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge, refusing to look at the crowd, refusing to let them see her bleed. She took the stand. The Bible was placed under her hand. She swore to tell the truth. Mrs. Crow, the judge said, his voice softening slightly, though his eyes remained sharp. Tell us what happened. Rose took a breath. The air in the room was freezing, but she felt flushed with heat. I am the cause of this, she began, her voice shaking, but she swallowed and forced it to steady. I am the reason Eli Ward is dead. She did not look at Daniel. She looked at the air above the crowd. I was lonely, she said. I was unfaithful to my husband. The whispers in the room erupted into a buzz. The judge banged his gavel. Silence, Rose continued, her voice gaining strength from the very shame she was exposing. She told them everything. She spoke of the saloon where she had worked before Daniel found her. She spoke of the way the town had treated her, like filth, like something to be used and discarded. She did not sugarcoat her own sins. She admitted to the stolen moments with Eli, the barn, the betrayal. Then she turned her eyes to Daniel. But you do not know this man, she said, pointing at her husband. You see a killer. I see the man who saved me when no one else would. I see a man who worked himself into the ground, dawn to dusk, to put a roof over my head. He never raised a hand to me, not once, even when the drought took everything, even when he was tired enough to die. He was gentle. She looked back at the judge. Eli Ward was charming, she said, her voice breaking slightly. He made me feel seen, but he was also reckless. She took a deep breath. Daniel went out there to tell him to leave, to protect our marriage. It was Eli who drew the gun. Luke Ward jumped to his feet. "She is lying," he shouted, his voice booming off the rafters. "She is lying to save his neck." "Sit down, Mr. Ward," the judge roared. Rose did not flinch. "I am not lying," she said clearly. "Daniel told me everything. He was terrified. He hid the body because he was afraid that you would hang him without listening, and afraid that you would destroy me. He was wrong to hide it. I know that. But he is not a cold-blooded killer. He is a good man who was pushed into a corner by my mistakes and his own fear." She stepped down from the stand. Her legs felt like water. She had stripped herself bare in front of the people who hated her. She had given them every reason to despise her, just to plant a seed of doubt about Daniel's guilt. She sat down behind Daniel. He did not turn around, but she saw his shoulders drop, as if a great weight had been lifted. Luke Ward was shaking with rage. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Luke stood up, his face purple. "He shot my brother like a dog," Luke yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Daniel. "And now he hides behind a woman's skirts. Eli was a good man. He never hurt anyone." Luke lunged toward the defense table. The bailiff moved to intercept him, but Luke was fueled by grief and fury. He shoved the deputy aside. "I will kill you myself." "Crow!" Luke screamed. In the scuffle, the sheriff stepped forward. Grabbing Luke by the collar, Luke swung wildly, his coat flying open. He pulled a gun on him, just like he pulled a gun on that card dealer in Abilene, Luke shouted, losing control of his own narrative in his anger. He always thought he was faster than he was. The room froze. Luke realized what he had said. He went still, panting. The sheriff looked at the judge. "Is that true?" "Sheriff?" the judge asked. "Did Eli Ward have a history of violence?" The sheriff sighed, tipping his hat back. "I sent a wire to Abilene, Judge, and one to Tucson. Eli Ward was known to be quick to draw when he had liquor in him. He had 2 warrants for brandishing a weapon in a dispute." The revelation sucked the air out of Luke's argument. The pattern was there. It lent weight to Daniel's claim of self-defense. The judge called for a recess. The crowd buzzed, the mood shifting. It was no longer a simple story of murder. It was a mess of human frailty. When the judge returned, the sun had moved, casting the room in gray shadow. "Daniel Crow." The judge said, "Stand up." Daniel stood. Rose held her breath, her hands gripping the back of his chair until her knuckles turned white. "I find that the death of Eli Ward was the result of a struggle in which you were not the aggressor." The judge ruled. "The claim of self-defense stands. You will not hang." A gasp went through the room. Rose let out a sob, covering her mouth. "However," the judge continued, his voice hard, "you concealed a death. You buried a man in secret and lied to the law and to his kin. For that, you cannot go unpunished. I sentence you to 2 years in the territorial prison at Yuma. 2 years. It was a lifetime, but it was life." The gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. The crowd erupted. Some were outraged, shouting that it was a travesty. Others were relieved that blood would not be spilled. Luke Ward was apoplectic. He stormed out of the courthouse, kicking the doors open, his face a mask of hate. As the sheriff led Daniel out the back door to avoid the crowd, a commotion started in the street. Luke had gathered a dozen men, drifters, ranch hands, men who liked violence. They stood near the jail wagon, ropes in their hands. "We will not let him walk," Luke shouted. "Bring him out." The sheriff pushed Daniel behind him and raised his Winchester rifle. "Go home, Luke, it is done. We will see justice done," Luke yelled. Rose stepped out from the doorway. She moved to stand beside the sheriff, directly in front of Daniel. She had no weapon. She had only her presence. She looked at the men, her chin lifted. "You will have to go through me," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the cold air. "You want to hang him? You hang me too." The mob falters. These were rough men, but few were willing to ride down a woman standing in the snow, especially one who had just bared her soul in court. The shame of it, combined with the sheriff's leveled rifle, broke their resolve. One by one, they turned away. Luke spat on the ground, glared at Daniel one last time, and mounted his horse. "I will be waiting." "Crow," he threatened. Then he rode off. The sheriff hustled Daniel into the holding cell to wait for the prison wagon. He gave them 5 minutes. The cell was cold, the iron bars biting into the space between them. Daniel stood on one side, Rose on the other. They reached through the bars, gripping each other's hands so tightly it hurt. 2 years, Daniel whispered. "It is a long time. We have weathered worse," Rose said fiercely. "We survived the drought. We survived the storm. We will survive this." Daniel looked at her stomach. Her hand moved there instinctively. They had not spoken of it, but the possibility hung between them. It had been months since Eli, and months since Daniel. The timing was a blur of grief and confusion. "If," Daniel started, his voice catching. "If there is a child?" Rose looked down. "I do not know. Daniel, I truly do not know whose it is." Daniel squeezed her hands, forcing her to look at him. "It does not matter," he said. "Do you hear me? If you are carrying a child, it is ours. I will raise it. I will love it. No questions. No resentment. It will be a crow." Rose nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "Thank you." The guard came to the door. "Time to go. Crow." They leaned in, their faces pressed against the cold iron bars. They kissed. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and iron and fear. It was a promise and a goodbye. "Wait for me," Daniel whispered against her lips. "I will be at the gate," she promised. Then the guard pulled him away. Rose watched him go, her hands still gripping the bars, until the door clanged shut and she was alone. The seasons turned, indifferent to the dramas of men. The white grip of winter slowly loosened. The snow melted into the earth, turning the plains into a vast sea of mud that sucked at wagon wheels and boots. Then the green came, tentative at first, then exploding in a riot of grass and wildflowers fed by the heavy winter snows. Rose worked. She worked with a ferocity that silenced the neighbors. She hired 2 older hands to help with the heavy lifting, but she ran the ranch. She did the books. She negotiated with the bank, using the money Daniel had hidden to hold off the foreclosure. Her belly grew. The town watched her with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. She did not hide. She walked into the general store with her head high, daring anyone to say a word. Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Higgins still whispered, but they did so behind their hands now. Rose Crow had become something formidable. In the height of summer, when the heat made the air shimmer, Rose rode out to the lone cottonwood. She brought a shovel and a simple wooden cross she had made herself. She cleared the brush from the pile of stones. She set the cross into the earth. It had no name, just the date. "I am sorry, Eli," she said to the wind. "I am sorry for the lies, and I am sorry that I used you to find myself." She stood there for a long time, letting go of the fantasy. Eli had been a dream of escape. Daniel was the reality of home. She left the grave and did not look back. The baby was born in the autumn, a boy with dark eyes and a lusty cry. Rose named him William. She looked for Eli in his face, and she looked for Daniel. She saw only the baby. He was himself. News came in late August of the 2nd year, overcrowding at Yuma, good behavior. A sentence commuted. Daniel came home on a Tuesday. The land was baked dry again, the smell of wild sage and dust hanging heavy in the air. Rose was on the porch, rocking the baby. When she saw the dust cloud on the road, she knew. She walked down to the gate. She stood there, the baby in her arms, her heart hammering against her ribs. Daniel walked the last mile. He was thinner. His coat hung loosely on his frame. His hair was graying at the temples, and the lines around his eyes were etched deep by the desert sun and the hardness of prison. But his stride was steady. He stopped 10 feet away. He took off his hat, twisting the brim in his hands. He looked at her. He looked at the bundle in her arms. "Rose," he said. His voice was raspy, unused to softness. "Daniel," she replied. He dropped his hat and stepped forward. He did not touch her at first. He looked at the baby. The boy was sleeping. His small fist curled against his cheek. "Is this him?" Daniel asked. "This is William," Rose said. Daniel reached out a finger. He touched the baby's cheek. The skin was impossibly soft against his rough, scarred hand. He looked at the child, searching for a ghost, searching for a reason to be angry. He found none. He felt only a fierce, overwhelming surge of protectiveness. He looked up at Rose. His eyes were clear. "Hello." "William," he whispered. He held out his arms. Rose passed the child to him. Daniel held the baby awkwardly at first, then settled him against his chest. He closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of milk and life. "He is ours," Daniel said firmly. "Ours." Rose agreed. They walked back to the house together. The distance between them finally closed. That night, the house was quiet. The baby slept in a cradle by the hearth. Daniel and Rose stood in the bedroom. The lamp was turned low. They undressed slowly, without the frantic urgency of their youth. Daniel's body bore new scars from the prison. Rose's body was changed by childbirth, softer in places, marked by the journey. They looked at each other without pretense. There was shame there. Yes, there was the memory of betrayal, but there was also survival. Daniel reached out and pulled her to him. They lay down on the bed that had once been a battleground of silence. Their lovemaking was slow. It was deeply emotional, a conversation of touch. They did not try to erase the past, they acknowledged it. They held each other with the knowledge of how easily they could be broken, and how hard they had fought to be here. It was not a perfect love. It was a scarred love, but it was real. In the months that followed, they rebuilt the ranch. They mended the fences that had fallen. They replanted the garden. They weathered new storms. A sickness that swept through the herd. A winter that froze the pump. The town slowly adjusted. People are creatures of habit, and eventually, the scandal faded into history. Some would always whisper. Luke Ward never stopped hating them, though he kept his distance, knowing the sheriff was watching. But others softened. They saw the way Daniel carried the boy on his shoulders. They saw the way Rose stood beside him at the fence line. They saw a family that had walked through fire and come out the other side. The story ends on a late autumn evening. The sun was sinking low over the plains, painting the sky in bands of gold and violet. Daniel and Rose rode out to the edge of the property, near the wash. Daniel held William in front of him on the saddle. They stopped by the lone cottonwood. The wooden cross Rose had planted was weathered now, gray like the tree. They sat in silence, listening to the wind rattle the dry leaves. They looked at the grave. It was no longer a secret that poisoned them. It was a scar on the land, a reminder of the price they had paid. Rose reached out and took Daniel's hand. He squeezed it, his grip warm and solid. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I am ready." They turned their horses away from the grave, away from the past. They rode back toward the ranch house, where the windows were glowing with yellow light against the coming dark. They rode toward a future that was not promised, but earned. They were scarred. They were forgiven as much as two people can be. And they were determined to live out their days in a love that had outlasted judgment, tragedy, and the wild, indifference cruelty of the West. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Daniel and Rose resonated with you. I would love to hear your thoughts on their ending. Did they find the redemption they deserved? Please leave a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. Until next time, keep your fences mended and your powder dry.